So we're going to start with the Syro-Phoenician woman. That's where we're at. If you weren't with us last week, we made it all the way through the story of the Syro-Phoenician woman. So that's where we're going to begin. But we're going to start, as we always do, with our prayer. So this week, our prayer comes from Saint Teresa of Avila, and this is a wonderful little prayer that she wrote. So I would invite you to kind of be in a spirit of prayer and let yourself just kind of be in the moment wherever you may be, knowing that Christ is with us, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, we are bound together in love, no matter where we may find ourselves this day. I know many of us hold in our hearts the families, the children, the community of Covenant Church and Covenant School. And our hearts break yet again. And then I know there are people in our own lives who we pray for. So I just invite you to hold all of those folks in your heart, in your prayers. As we just kind of hold a silence for a moment, and then I'll offer this prayer by Saint Teresa. Let nothing disturb you and nothing frighten you, for all things are passing. Patient endurance attains all things. One whom God possesses wants nothing, for God alone suffices. May it be so. Amen. Anything from chapter 7 up to the Syro-Phoenician woman, any questions, comments, thoughts from last week that arose? If not, then we'll move on to the Syro-Phoenician woman. But was there anything that came up for you as you reviewed?
I noticed several times when he performs a miracle, he says, and told the disciples too, go, but don't tell anybody about this. Is that mentioned in the other gospel?
Much more infrequently, Dave. It's not that those words don't come out of his mouth in Matthew or Luke. Not so much in John. John is not worried about any kind of secret that Jesus is the Christ in any way, shape, or form in the Gospel of John. But because Matthew and Luke utilize the Gospel of Mark as a kind of a primer for their own Gospels, sometimes those stories carry over. But for Mark, it's a real theme throughout the Gospel of Mark, and we will continue to see that. That's called the messianic secret. And the reason that preachers and scholars have given over the years as to why the messianic secret is important, we'll actually talk about a little bit in chapter 8, which is Jesus doesn't want people to talk about him being the Messiah because they have a misunderstood version of what the Messiah is. And so until they understand what it means for him to be the Messiah, he does not want people talking about the fact that he is the Messiah. And we'll talk about that today, because we get this great example, this great story in chapter 8 about Peter actually getting it right for a moment, right? He actually gets it right. Finally, one of the disciples says the right thing, and then he immediately gets it wrong, like almost like he has a fleeting moment of understanding, and then it's kind of like Peter walking on water, right? He does it for like a brief moment, and then he starts to sink. That's kind of the same thing that goes on in chapter 8 here, but that's a good question, and it's one of the hallmarks of the Gospel of Mark is this idea that constantly, over and over again, like, don't tell anybody what I did. Don't tell anybody what I did. And of course, people talk about it all the time, right? Obviously, people talked about it because we have the stories.
Yeah. Well, there's one comment in there after he said don't tell anybody, then the next verse says, of course, everybody went out and talked about it.
Right, exactly. Right. That's exactly right. So no, but you'll see that occur even some more as we get closer to the Passion in Jerusalem. But that starts to drop off because as we get closer to Jerusalem and the cross, then the true meaning of messiahship starts to reveal itself. And so that's a theme in the Gospel of Mark. Everything is seen through the lens of the cross, and we'll see that we get the first sense of that here in chapter 8. But let's begin. So this is where we are. Today we will bounce around. We are in the area, if you can see up right there at the corner of the square, or where it says Israel at the time of Jesus, right there at the bottom right hand corner, you see Tyre. That's where we will find ourselves at the beginning of our time tonight with the Syrophoenician woman. Jesus will then cross over to the other side, be down by Bethsaida, down into the Decapolis, and then we'll cross back over to, in your Bible, you may have it mentioned as the district of Dalmanutha, but that is one name for the city of Magdala. So when we get back after the feeding of the 4,000, we'll be in the region around Magdala, and then we cross back over to Bethsaida, and then we go up to Caesarea Philippi. And so you can see Jesus and the disciples are just getting all sorts of their steps in. They're covering a great deal of ground, both in Jewish territory and in Gentile territory. And he's sort of bouncing back and forth. But once he crosses over again, at the end of chapter 8 into Galilee, he'll start heading south, and we'll start heading towards Jerusalem. And so we're almost to that place where Jesus will sort of turn his gaze towards Jerusalem, and that will become an all-important thing. But I want you to have a sense of where we are. We're starting today at Tyre, coming down to Bethsaida, back up to Caesarea Philippi, back down to Magdala. Oh, spending some time in the Decapolis. Like they really are moving all over the map, literally moving all over the map. So I wanted you to get a sense of this story about the Syrophoenician woman. In Matthew's gospel, the story, he has a version of this story, and he describes the Syrophoenician woman by her religion, which is Canaanite. Canaanite is a religion, but Syrophoenician is a racial and ethnic distinction. And so this woman who comes to see Jesus in Tyre, let me go back just real quick. You can see like the region of Syrophoenicia. So she would have been, her homeland would have been just slightly north of where you see Sidon, in the region of Syrophoenicia. And so she's traveled a little bit of ways to get to Jesus as well. She is technically in Jewish territory, but so she would have been a foreigner, if you will, into Jewish territory from the region of Syrophoenicia. And when she comes and asks Jesus to heal her daughter, who is possessed by a demon, and I mentioned at the end of class last week that when we hear that she is possessed, we don't get a description of what her ailments are or what her symptoms are, but we have encountered enough demonically possessed people in the Gospel of Mark that we should understand that she could be a danger to herself in terms of self-harm. She could be a danger to others in terms of violently thrashing about and harming them. She would be ritualistically unclean, and so therefore not able to participate in the community. she is real. If her symptoms are anything like the other symptoms of demonically possessed people that we read about in the Gospel of Mark, she is not in a good situation. And so this woman comes and sits at the feet of Jesus as he has entered into this home trying to get a little bit of rest. And she asks, no, if you read to chapter 7, verse 26, she begs him. That is the level of this despair and distraught and panic that she is in. She doesn't ask Jesus to do this for her. She begs of him to do that. And let's be true. And let's just call this like it is. Jesus's response is not that kind. So in verse 27, Jesus says to her, after she is begging for his help, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Jesus refers to her and her people as dogs. And in the gospel, in the Hebrew Bible, dogs are equated with pigs as two of the most ritualistically unclean animals, which I know is going to hurt everyone's spirit here, because I know there are so many dog lovers amongst us, but all of you cat lovers can rejoice. Cats are very clean and are ritualistically pure in the Jewish faith. There you go, Judy, in the ancient Jewish faith. But those of us who love dogs, they're equated with pigs. They're about as unclean as you could possibly be. So, this is a racial slur that Jesus throws at this woman. Let's just be frank. He is unkind to her initially. And I've read so many commentaries and heard so many sermons that apologize for him. And I wish we wouldn't, because I actually think we do him a disservice by apologizing for his behavior here, because his second response is what our second response should be. And let me tease this out for you a little bit. So she begs for his help. Then he dismisses her in a pretty blunt and rude way, using an ethnic slur to describe her. And then she comes back, and you imagine, he has argued with Pharisees, temple scribes, lawyers, and he has bested them over and over and over again in rhetoric. And she comes back with this zinger of a comeback to him, and his mind is opened. Like, he was confronted with his bias, and instead of doubling down and hardening of his heart, she actually softens his heart. And then Jesus does his Jesus thing, where he heals her daughter of demonic possession. And I don't know about you, but I find this to be incredibly hopeful for us, that when we have a bias that is pointed at, that is inherent due to our upbringing, and that we might not even be aware that we carry with us, maybe even a subconscious bias and discrimination towards other people, that when we are presented with it and we are confronted with it, so many of us get so defensive and double down on it, or we dismiss it. Whereas Jesus is confronted by it, and immediately he corrects his behavior and his outlook. And I think that's such a powerful example for us, to say that if Jesus is truly human, then of course he grew up with cultural biases just like the rest of us do. But when we are called on him, he changes. And I don't know about you, but I find that to be an incredibly refreshing story. And I'm kind of glad that Mark and Matthew decided to include this story in their gospels, because Luke and John do not. And I think it's easy to present a perfect Messiah, but here Mark is presenting a truly human Messiah for us. And yet Jesus still continues to like show. Tim, you got a comment?
I always kind of took that passage as Jesus was saying, if I may defend Jesus a little here, that the timing was just wrong, that his ministry was to purify the temple. It was for the Jews. And it would be later that with Paul, etc., that the ministry would expand to the Gentiles and everyone.
Yeah. I would hear that so much better, Tim, if I can just push back on that a little bit, if Jesus didn't call her a dog.
Yeah. Okay.
No, if Jesus said, listen, I'd love to help, but I really are here for my people first. And then I'll, I'm prioritizing my folk before I do anything else. I really am sorry. Like that kind of thing. Like I really want to help, but it's not time. But Jesus calls her a dog.
Yeah.
And that is a known first century slur that Jewish people use for non-Jewish folk. So that's the only reason why I push back on that interpretation, because that is the interpretation that so many apologists, preachers, scholars do use for Jesus. And I think it's because we're not comfortable with an imperfect Jesus. So many of us grew up with Jesus is just, he's perfect in every way. But I think what makes him perfect is that when he makes a mistake, he's willing to like correct himself. That's perfection. It's not like anyway. I still want him to be perfect too, but I look at it as a different type of perfection. Any other interpretations? Tim, thanks for sharing that, because that is the classic take. Anybody else heard this story in a different way? I think this woman is a hero. Like I love her so much. Like I really do. Does anyone else have a thought on her?
Just a quick note on one of my footnotes says that she's the only one mentioned in Mark that calls him Lord. And I wonder if that really brought him like to a standstill for a second, too, as well as stating what she said about being a dog.
Good point, Sherry. So again, we talk about we're gonna end tonight with that question that Jesus asked the disciples: who do you say that I am? Yeah. And here she answers that question and implicitly by clearly seeing who he is. So again, part of the Gospel of Mark's themes are outsiders recognize Jesus implicitly, insiders miss who he is all the time. And here we have she is a quadruple outsider. She is a rival to the Jewish people. She is a foreigner in Jewish land. She is ritualistically unclean herself, in that she has been in the presence of a demonically possessed person and her daughter. And she is, as far as we know, an unattended woman without any male escort, which would be totally taboo at that point in first century Judaism. And so she is a quadruple outsider. And like you said, Sherry, she recognizes Jesus implicitly.
Yeah. And then it's like he rewards her for all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
By healing or getting the demons out of the daughter.
Yeah.
So it's, unwavering faith was, in him.
Right. And I mean, again, I've said this so many times, not a parent, but so moved by her love for her daughter, right? To cross so many social taboos, to be able to get to Jesus and hope that he will help her is, I think, very inspiring in terms of her. This story is then paired with the story of the man who has hearing and vision impairment. So these two stories are paired together in terms of this being this great example of God's just abundant love and grace for people in their circumstances in life. So this gentleman is completely shut off from the world. I mean, we don't know when he became blind or how long he was deaf, but at least for a while, he has not been able to see or hear the beauty and the blessedness of the world around him. And he is, again, due to his physical circumstances, cut off from his community, cut off from the rest of the world. And so Jesus' ministry to him and Jesus' healing restores him and opens him up to that. And so here is yet again, and this time in very much in Gentile territory as he goes into the Decapolis. And here is a Jew, here's a non-Jew who Jesus heals, and it's just, I think when you pair the two of them together, they are such a powerful example of how there are no boundaries and there are no borders to God's love and God's desire for us to sort of live in the grace of God and to know God's abundant love. And Jesus, as a representation of that, is showing us how it is okay for us to cross these human constructs of borders and cultural, ethics and things of that nature. It's the walls that we sort of build up, Jesus just breaks down and crosses all the time. And then just if you look down at verse 34 in chapter 7, you have Jesus, you have Mark, I should say, not translating the Aramaic Ephatha. You don't have Mark translating that, but using the Aramaic. And I always like to point out whenever we get what we can only assume is Jesus's like true the words that Jesus actually spoke. As we always like to remind ourselves that we're reading an English translation of probably a Greek or Latin translation, which then themselves were translated from Aramaic. And so whenever we get to see and read and hear the words that Jesus actually spoke and said, are very, very important. But then as Dave pointed out at the beginning of our time today, in verse 36, Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. Again, not a parent, but I've been a child, and the more my parents told me not to do something, the more I wanted to do something. So, so I can appreciate, don't do that. Okay, that's exactly what I'm going to do. That sounds like fun. So we are done with chapter 7. So anything else about the Syrophoenician woman or the deaf man, the deaf blind man who Jesus heals? Anything else that jumped out at you? Well, let's move on to the second now. The second of the feeding miracles. So let me hide that. There we go. So again, give you a sense of where we are. Jesus is, he was in the region of Tyre. He crossed over, it came down into the Decapolis. You see the Decapolis on the right-hand side of the map. And then we kind of think that the second of these feeding miracles, the feeding of the 4,000, takes place around Bethsaida. That he kind of comes a little bit more north and back to the Sea of Galilee, but he's still in Gentile territory. And so I found this, and it's I think a really good comparison between the two feeding miracles. The feeding of the 5,000 is found in the other gospels. The feeding of the 4,000 is found in the Gospel of Mark. And you can kind of see how they are similar and yet very different from each other. So the first one takes place in chapter 6. The second one takes place in chapter 8. One is on the northwest side versus the southeast side of the Sea of Galilee. One is in the Gentile territory. One is in Jewish territory. And you can see where Jesus is, moved by compassion for the crowd who is very hungry. But they mention different things, right? And so if you look at the bottom of this chart, you can see that Jesus uses Eucharistic language, blesses the bread, breaks the bread, shares the bread. That is very Eucharistic. You'll hear that on Sunday, the blessing, the breaking, the sharing. And so that's a very important part of both stories. Both have allusions to, the manna from heaven, but the manna from heaven is more explicit allusion in the feeding of the 4,000 than it is the feeding of the 5,000, which is interesting because obviously the feeding, the manna story is very much a part of Jewish lore and Jewish history. There are a few fish that are mentioned in the feeding of the 4,000, where the feeding of the 5,000 is very much 2 fish. And then you have the numbers, and numbers are very important. So the leftover baskets, the leftover baskets of food for the feeding of the 5,000 in Jewish territory comes to 12, which is the number of tribes, meaning, and so that number 12 is sort of a representation of all the people, right? All the people of Judaism, all the people of all the Hebrew people are being fed by Jesus by that symbolic number of 12. Whereas 7 in sort of the Greek world is a number of perfection and completion. And so by having there being 7 baskets left over of food in the Gentile territory, sort of the significance of that number being it is complete, and it is enough, and it is perfect. This miracle that happens, and Jesus opening up the ministry to the Gentile people. And we mentioned this at when we read the story of the 5,000. It says that 5,000 men were fed. And so we have to say that honestly, that's undercounting the number of people who got fed, because we have no reason to doubt that there would be women and children there as well. Whereas the number for being fed in the second story is 4,000, but it's an estimate. The second one is about 4,000 people. So it's not a direct number. And then when it's all said and done, they go to the region of Magdala. And these two stories combined then lead the disciples to ask the question about, what does this bread mean? And so and Jesus sort of tries to explain to them in chapter 8 verses 18 through 21. He tries to explain it to them. It's this kind of teaching moment that Jesus has with them. You can kind of sense some of his frustration, but he tries to get them to fully understand what has happened, what they've seen. And I think that's a really important foreshadowing to the rest of chapter 8. That very last question in verse 21, which is, do you not yet how is it that you do not understand yet? And so again, we get this this sense of like the disciples just don't, they're just not getting it. And this verse really kind of highlights that. So the two stories, the feeding of the 5,000 versus the feeding of the 4,000, they are not the same story, and they are not trying to say the same thing, but they are saying similar things. But they're both incredibly important, and they sort of bookend Jesus's healing, compassion ministry. Not all of it. We'll still read a few stories of exorcisms and healings and everything, but we're pretty much done with all of that in the Gospel of Mark. The feeding of the 4,000 is sort of one of the last kind of major miracles that Jesus performs in the Gospel of Mark. And so again, there were miracles prior to the feeding of the 5,000, and there will be a couple of miracles after the feeding of the 4,000. But these two feeding stories kind of bookend Jesus's healing compassion ministry in the Gospel of Mark. So they also kind of are used in more of a narrative literary sense for Mark to kind of set aside this part of Jesus's ministry. So they're very, very important in that way. Many of us know the story of the feeding of the 5,000. How many of you were at least not that familiar with the second story? Yeah, you hadn't heard it. You don't remember reading it. It's not on the lectionary. So, so Diane, I mean, you've been kind of going to church a long time. I'm guessing you felt the need to kind of attend with Dick.
You're right. I was there. Yeah.
Yeah, you were there. So, I mean, have you ever heard Dick preach on the feeding of the 4,000?
I have not, that I've heard, but you better believe when I leave here, I'm going to go ask him if he remembers doing it. Yeah. So
it's not on the lectionary. So if you're familiar with what the lectionary is, it's the it's the guide that we have to say, like, this Sunday preach on these verses.
Yeah.
And
why do you think that is?
Because the feeding of the 5,000 is the much more popular and known story.
I see.
And I think the lectionary people, I don't know, I'd have to, I haven't. Gary, you don't know, do you know anybody that like helps with the lectionary? Yeah, me neither. I'm guessing, Diane, it's more, they feel like it's redundant.
Yeah.
Like,
been there, done that. Okay, I got it.
And it's not, but they're different stories, and they emphasize different things. But in Mark, they were equally important. So, but he seems to be the only one who kind of found it equally important. All right, so let's move ahead. If you can jump ahead to chapter 8, verse 27. So who do you say that I am? Jesus's identity has been a central part of the Christian faith really since its inception. And this is what theologians do. And this is what I think all Christians do, is they're asking themselves this question of who is Jesus for me? Who do I say that Jesus is? And, if you ask people around Park Church, you'll get a lot of different answers from, he's the Messiah, the Savior of the world, and the Son of God is, seated at the right hand, to other people in the church who no doubt will say, well, he was a great teacher, a great prophet, he teaches us how to live, but they might not have that more of a they would have like a more limited view of Jesus's divinity, and you'll find everybody else in between, like on that spectrum. And it's a really fascinating question of who do you say that I am. I didn't grow up going to Sunday school, too long. My family stopped going to church around second grade, when I was in second grade, and so I got the very early parts of Jesus's of kind of like Sunday school, and no joke, one of my earliest ways of thinking about Jesus was he was like a Snow White figure, because like I just kept remember seeing like all these pictures around the church of Jesus, like in very, very clean, flowy robes and garments, and like there being like squirrels and birds and bunnies around, and like and then I remember seeing like Cinderella or Snow White and like and like the Disney cartoons, and they were like had like bunnies and squirrels and birds following them everywhere. And it's like, so as like a young kid, like that was my idea of Jesus, was like, oh, he's kind of like a Snow White or a Cinderella kind of person, just animals just kind of follow him everywhere. Not the most sophisticated theological position, but for like a first grader, but that was my idea. So and things change obviously as you get older, but if you would have asked me at first grade, like, who do you say that Jesus is, I'd be like, he's kind of like Cinderella. Long flowing robes, and animals seem to like him a lot. So this is a really important part of the Christian faith, right? Who do you say that Jesus is? And smart people and faithful people have been working on that question for a long time. So when we get to that story, he turns to them and he says, who do you the people say that I am? And the disciples offer what the public has been saying about him. Notice, because John the Baptist has died, that people are saying that he's John the Baptist, meaning that he's a resurrected John the Baptist, which is very important for us to remember. One, Jesus and John seem to have a very special relationship, and so maybe people are thinking that he's kind of carrying on John's mission. That could be one way of looking at it. But John is known to be dead at this point. But we forget that first century Judaism had a belief in resurrection of the dead prior to Jesus. Christianity did not invent the idea of resurrection. It's an idea, a theological idea that we inherited from our Jewish ancestors. Resurrection of the dead became popular in Jewish thought about 200 to 300 BCE. And by the time that Jesus was doing his public ministry, it was very much commonplace among a large swath of Jewish people. So some folks thought he was the resurrected John the Baptist. The other example that the disciples give is that Jesus is the prophet Elijah. And that is not just saying that Jesus is a powerful prophet who does many of the same things that Elijah did. If you read the stories of Elijah in the book of Kings, First and Second Kings, then a lot of the same miracles that Jesus performs, a lot of the same healings that Jesus performs, Elijah does many of the same things, and so they might think that he's a new incarnation of the prophet Elijah, which would then mean that they have this messianic expectation, because in Jewish prophecy, Elijah returns to prepare the way for the Messiah. So there is this fervor of messianic expectation. If people think that Jesus is Elijah, then they are expecting the Messiah to arrive at any time. But of course, Peter doesn't say either one of those two things. Peter, much like the Syrophoenician woman, makes an affirmation of faith. And he says, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus tells them to say nothing. Peter gets it right. Jesus does not say you're wrong. He doesn't tell the disciples that they're wrong either, but he definitely doesn't tell Peter that he's wrong. But he does tell Peter to say nothing. And we get a very clear reason as to why in the very next bit of chapter 8, which is we get the first of 3 passion predictions in the Gospel of Mark. Mark 8:31, which we read for today. Next week, you'll read Mark 9:31. And then in Mark 10:32 through 34, we have 3 back-to-back-to-back passion predictions spoken by Jesus to the disciples. Each time that Jesus speaks of his passion, he is redefining the idea of the Son of Man and the messianic expectation. And he's doing so through the lens of redemptive suffering. Real quick, that picture, you see the Darryl crucifix, which still hangs to this day in the Cathedral of Cologne. That picture does not do that justice. That is a 7-foot tall crucifix that hangs in that cathedral, and is one of the earliest Germanic crucifixes ever created. And it was commissioned by Pope Giro in the 9th century, and has become a real symbol of the redemptive suffering of Christ. If you know, during if you're familiar with what was going on in the 9th century in Europe, that's at the heart of the plague and the Black Death. And so the idea that Jesus was suffering with them through that horrible pandemic was a very powerful symbol of God's love and God's care for them. And so Jesus redefines this idea of the Son of Man and the messianic expectations. And so let's look at that. If you look at chapter 8, verse 31, let's look at this passion prediction really, really carefully. So notice Jesus does not say the Son of Man must be crucified. He says the Son of Man must undergo great suffering. But he does give the prediction that 3 days later will rise again. So it's not all bleak. It's not all suffering, but it's redemptive suffering. It's this idea that one will be willing to undergo suffering for a greater good. And of course, that gets played out on so many different ways, right? On a very personal level, of parents, willing to sacrifice and suffer for the good of their children, to sort of on a societal level, like Gandhi's march to the salt mines in India to suffer on behalf of Indian liberation from the British Empire. There's lots of different ways that redemptive suffering kind of works. But if you think about what the messianic expectations of Jesus's time were, it was that the Messiah would come in on a horse with a sword and lead an army to liberate Israel from Roman occupation. And Jesus is redefining the power of the Messiah, not in might, not in physical might, but through this lens of redemptive suffering. And Peter doesn't like it. Peter rejects this reinterpretation of Jesus, of the Messiah and the Son of Man, through this redemptive suffering lens, and rebukes Jesus, which I just think is such a wonderful little, there's a piece of me that was like, yeah, you go, Peter, come on, man. He stood up for himself. He didn't back down, right? He stood up for himself to his rabbi. Here's the disciple. It's kind of like, I've mentioned my dad and I were, we sometimes had some very heated conversations. I think my dad would have loved to have like told me to get behind him sometimes. But you know, this is what kind of Peter's doing. He's sort of standing up for himself. And Jesus has one of the best like kind of smackdowns of all time, and tells Peter to, you know, get behind me, Satan, which is basically get in step with me. Jesus does not think that Peter is Satan. He's using exaggeration to get through to Peter that his mind isn't in the right place. Obviously, Jesus doesn't think that Peter is Satan. It's hyperbole to make a point. And the point is that Peter needs to get in step with the way that Jesus is walking, and he's very soon going to be walking to Jerusalem. And as we all are this week, as we enter Holy Week, so it's a good one to kind of get into. Then finally, notice at that point he had only been talking to the disciples, but he kind of recognizes, all right, it's time to bring the crowds in, and he does this teaching about denying oneself, picking up our cross and following him, which is these very, very hard words for many of us to hear. But it is his way of reforming and transforming our lives and reforming and transforming our world, is through this sort of denying of the old self, so that we can, through redemptive suffering, we can have a new self. And if you look at verse 38, those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes into the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So there's a lot to unpack in that very last verse of chapter 8. Adulterous in this sense is not sexual infidelity. Adulterous in this sense is infidelity to God. So it's not a carnal sin that Jesus is talking about, in terms of that everyone was going around fornicating with outside of the bonds of marriage. Jesus is talking about being outside of the covenant with God. And maybe a better way of understanding adulterous in this case is idolatrous. It actually reads a little bit better if you say, those of you who are ashamed of me and my words in this idolatrous and sinful generation. You really get a better sense of what Jesus is talking about here. What idols have we placed that we've gone chasing after, instead of walking the way that God is sort of calling us to. And so that's how the chapter 8 ends. And so then there is debate on that last verse of what it means of when he comes in the glory of his father with the holy angels. There's debate on when the glory happens. Does the glory happen on Easter with the resurrection? Because there are angels in that story. Or does glory happen at the end times and there's debate on what Jesus meant there. And there's not consensus. Some people read that and read end times. Other people read that and read Easter. And so I don't have a stake in that. I'll let other people who are smarter than me kind of hash that out. But I did want you to know that doesn't necessarily mean the end times. There's a great group of people who think that that has already kind of been fulfilled through the Easter event. So that's chapter 8. You are halfway through the Gospel of Mark. thoughts, comments, reflections on what you've learned so far, particularly in chapter 8? Picking up your cross, denying yourself, following Jesus. Sounds easy, right? Tim.
You warned us about Mark's brevity. Going to the who do people say that I am, and Peter's response, you're the Messiah. I look at the equivalent story in Matthew that really, and I'd like your input on this, but I think the Roman Catholics would say this is his establishment as the first pope.
Oh, sure.
With Mark coming before Matthew, chronologically writing, was there a sea change in thought, or was Mark's guy, Mark being Peter's guy, or Peter being self-deferential, just wouldn't say that explicitly like it was maybe said in Matthew, that you're the rock and I'll build my church on you. I just would love your input on the difference.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. So, so I've got two different takes on that, Tim, if you don't mind. My first one is both Matthew and Luke embellish on Mark's brevity. They are obviously not comfortable with how concise Mark is in his narrative. And they add details that both of them add details that Mark does not have. You know, not only this story as you're pointing out, but just look at like the temptation narratives. Both, like Mark says, and Jesus was in the desert for 40 days and was tempted, cut and dry, done, no reason to explain. Whereas Luke and Matthew go like, no, there's some really good stuff there. Let's flesh that out a little bit. So I do think there's just a sense that like Matthew felt that he could, whether he had different versions of those stories that he wanted to include, or he was privy to other information, or he just thought this was an excellent opportunity to embellish the story some. He definitely does that. In terms of, do I think that Peter, I can't speak for Peter, right? Obviously. But it would be my sense that that version of that you find in the Gospel of Matthew is not Peter's deference, but more so that Matthew had different information. Mark might not have had that information with him. And Peter might not have shared that story with him if indeed Peter is the one who's sort of dictating this story to Mark. But I don't want to go with deference. I would just go with Mark might not have that information. But you're absolutely right. And what I always love to point out to my friends is it was okay for the first pope to be married, but you know that was every pope since then can't get married. That's not true. That actually took about 150 years. About the first, I think about the first 6 or 7 popes were married, and then the celibacy sort of thing kicked in. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Any other reflections or comments or thoughts about the Gospel of Mark through 8 chapters? Because my favorite story is in the Gospel of Mark, and that's the 4 guys who bring their friend and like open up the roof and like lower their friend. I just love the image of like all of this dirt and grime like falling on Jesus as like these guys. I always think of them as kids. I don't know why. I've always imagined them as like youth. It just seems like a very youthful thing to do, like not taking no for an answer. The line's super long. Screw that. We're going up top. We're going to drop him down. Like that just seems like something a 17-year-old kid would do. I've always appreciated that. But if not seeing any, then we'll call it a night. All right. Thanks everybody. We'll meet next week for Holy Week. Have a wonderful rest of your night, and I'll see you soon. Thanks everyone.